Embarking on your photography journey, you'll come across many concepts and technical details that all revolve around the foundational concept of exposure. If you've ever found yourself confused by terms such as aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, or wondered why your images are either too dark or too bright, then this guide is for you. In this guide, I'll be covering everything you need to know about exposure, so let's dive right in. So what is exposure in photography? Exposure is the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor through the lens, which then affects how bright or dark your image turns out. Our goal as photographers is to take images that are well exposed. If your images aren't properly exposed, then they will either be underexposed or overexposed. If your image is too underexposed, then it will be dark, and if your image is too overexposed, then the highlights will be blown out and your image may look faded and just too bright. For example, here's an image I took making it underexposed and then overexposed. Often you may see images that are purposely underexposed or overexposed to create an artistic effect, which is popular on social media. In fact, I used to purposely underexpose my images just a little bit and post them on Instagram to create that moody look that is so popular. This is fine to do if you are intentionally doing it and you are doing it solely for your own creative purposes. But if you photograph clients like I do and you'll be delivering photos to them, then it's probably best that you capture a well-exposed photo because your client may not like the artistic effect you were trying to achieve. Now, in order to understand the concept of exposure, you need to understand the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is made up of 3 different settings that affect the overall exposure of your image: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. All 3 of these elements act like 3 cogs in a wheel. If you adjust one, then the other 2 will be affected. For example, let's say you're taking a picture of a really fast subject like a car. In order to freeze frame the car, you will need to use a very fast shutter speed, but this will let less light into your camera sensor. So in order to balance out the exposure, you'll need to use a wider aperture, which is a lower f-stop number, and a higher ISO. That's just one example of how changing one setting will affect the other 2. Let's look at all 3 settings individually to get a better understanding while using that analogy. Aperture, specifically the aperture blades in your lens, can open or shrink, which affects the amount of light that passes through the lens, affecting the overall exposure of your image. Depending on your aperture setting, your aperture blades will either shrink, letting less light pass through, or widen, letting more light pass through. The aperture setting in your camera is measured in f-stops. The lower the f-stop number, for example f1.8, then the wider the aperture and more light will come through, and the more shallow depth of field or background blur you will have. For example, here's an image I took using f1.8 for a shallow depth of field. The higher the f-stop number, such as f16, then the more narrow the aperture, which means less light will pass through, and the more narrow depth of field, which means everything in your scene will be more in focus. For example, as a portrait and headshot photographer, I'm often using lower f-stop numbers so I can have more shallow depths of field, creating that bokeh or background blur effect behind my subjects. Landscape photographers often use higher f-stop numbers so they can capture more of their scene in focus. Here's an aperture/f-stop chart that really helped me in the beginning for you to reference this and to better understand apertures and f-stops. Feel free to pause this video at this section. Shutter speed is the amount of time your camera shutter is open, which affects how long light can hit the sensor. Shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second, such as 1/250th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. One reason to control shutter speed is that it allows you to let more or less light into your camera sensor, depending on the time of day and light availability. If there's less light in your scene, such as during sunset or at night, you'll likely use a slower shutter speed to let more light in. If there's lots of light in your scene, like during midday, you'll likely use a faster shutter speed to let less light in. Another reason to control shutter speed is for motion effect, when you want to intentionally capture a motion blur image or a fast freeze frame shot. If you want to purposely capture motion blur, you'll likely use a slower shutter speed. For example, many long exposure photographers keep their shutters open for minutes or even hours, using a tripod of course. If you want to capture a freeze frame effect of a fast subject, you'll likely use a faster shutter speed like 1/1000th of a second. As a portrait photographer myself, I often try not to go below 1/150th of a second because I found that if I go lower, I can introduce some camera shake and blur into my image because how I shoot handheld. ISO is the sensitivity of your camera sensor to light. ISOs are measured in flat numbers such as ISO 400, ISO 1600, etc. The ISO number used to refer to film because different films were either more or less sensitive to light, so they quantified that sensitivity with ISO. Higher ISO numbers means your sensor is more sensitive to light, which will make your image more exposed if not balanced properly. Higher ISO numbers can also introduce digital noise, making your image look grainy, so that's something to watch out for. Because of this, you'll want to know the ISO level your camera can handle before it starts introducing significant digital noise, and try to stay under that level if you can. Here's a very high ISO image taken at ISO 16,000. Notice the noise. Here's a lower ISO image taken at ISO 2000. Notice it's less noisy. Lower ISO numbers means your sensor is less sensitive to light, which will make your image less exposed if not balanced properly. I usually adjust my ISO last out of all three settings, especially if I'm getting close to the limits where grain and digital noise will start to be introduced. Sometimes you have no choice to have noise in your image, and it's easy, especially now, to remove it in post-processing, but I found having it noise-free straight out of the camera always looks better. So knowing when to adjust each of the three settings is just dependent on remembering what each setting is primarily used for. So just remember aperture affects depth of field, shutter speed affects creating a motion blur or freeze frame effect, and ISO is raised higher when you're satisfied with the depth of field and motion effects achieved by your aperture and shutter speed settings, but still need to adjust the exposure. We've discussed the three settings that affect exposure. Now let's put it all together and go over the steps and tips I recommend using when you want to achieve the right exposure. In order to get the right exposure in any scene you're in, there are 7 steps you need to be aware of and take that I personally like to use. The first step is to understand the exposure triangle. We covered it earlier, but really take the time to fully understand each setting, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, so that you can quickly adjust your settings on the spot on photo shoots. The second step is to use the right metering mode. So cameras offer different metering modes such as evaluative, center weighted, and spot metering that allows you to measure the brightness of the scene. You want to be familiar with these different metering modes and then select the one best suited for your photography purposes. For example, I mostly photograph portraits and headshots, so I like using spot metering. The third step is to shoot in manual mode. Manual mode will allow you to have full control over your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings. While some photographers recommend you can shoot aperture priority or shutter speed priority, I recommend definitely learning manual mode first, and then once you understand it, maybe you can switch over to these priority modes. The fourth step is to start with aperture and shutter speed. Once you're in your photo shoot location, I'd recommend starting first with aperture and then shutter speed. This will allow you to dial in your desired depth of field and motion effect goals. Then the next step, the fifth step, is to adjust ISO as needed. After you're satisfied with your aperture and shutter speed, then adjust your ISO settings, making them higher if you still need more exposure in your image. The sixth step is to check your exposure meter. Once your settings are dialed in, put your eye in the viewfinder and get ready to take a photo and look at your exposure meter, which is usually on the bottom. This is the meter that shows a scale running from -3 to +3, or on some cameras -2 to +2, with the 0 in the middle representing what the camera believes to be the correct exposure. For example, in my exposure meter here, you can see that the photo is underexposed at -2. By looking at this line and marker, you'll get a good idea whether your photo is properly exposed or not. If it's overexposed or underexposed, then make the proper adjustments to your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Lastly, if you really want to check whether your image is properly exposed, look at the histogram within your camera. You can usually access the histogram within the playback function of your camera. Check your specific camera settings, but I can access my histogram by clicking Info while in the playback of an image. The histogram shows the distribution of brightness levels in your image from the blacks on the left to the whites on the right. If your image is well exposed, then the image will typically be balanced and spread across the histogram without big spikes on either end. Here's an example of that same scene underexposed. You can see this with the shift to the left, which is the shadows in the blacks. Personally, I don't always check the histogram after each image I took, especially if I'm on a client shoot, because I believe this would be terrible for the client experience. I usually just set my settings based on experience, and then just confirm that it's properly exposed by looking at the exposure meter and by doing a visual check in the playback area. So in conclusion, the best way to understand and get the proper exposure is just by practicing. The process of mastering exposure is more of a trial and error process, but it is the one you must take time to learn in your journey of learning photography. Take photos in different lighting conditions with subjects moving at different speeds. Play around with your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to see how it affects your images. After a while, you'll become more experienced and know right off the bat the ballpark range that your exposure settings should be at based on your current lighting. Good luck, have fun, and thanks for watching.